April 5, 1943. 2:18 a.m. Solomon Islands, South Pacific. A Japanese submarine is on fire. Not slowly, not quietly. The forward deck is consumed by orange flame cutting through absolute darkness, and 66 men inside that steel hull are about to make the worst decision of their lives. Above them, an American destroyer is bearing down at 35 knots. That is 40 miles per hour of 2,000 tons of steel aimed directly at their waterline. The math is brutal. Impact in 11 seconds. 10, 9, 8. And then an American sailor reaches into a storage locker. Not for a weapon, not for a torpedo, not for anything that makes military sense. He grabs a potato. Đừng quên nhấn like, đăng ký và bật thông báo để không bỏ lỡ những video hấp dẫn tiếp theo. Hãy cùng chúng tôi khám phá thêm nhiều câu chuyện sự kiện lịch sử và những khoảnh khắc đầy cảm hứng từ quá khứ. Hãy tham gia cộng đồng của chúng tôi ngay hôm nay. His name is Ambrose Hardin. Seaman First Class. 22 years old. Before the war, he worked on a farm in rural Massachusetts. He had never fired a torpedo. He had never commanded men in battle. He had never done a single thing that any military historian would consider remotely significant. But on this night in this darkness, with 66 Japanese sailors sprinting toward a deck gun, capable of blowing USS O'Bannon out of the water with a single shot, Ambrose Hardin threw that potato so accurately with such perfect timing that it froze an entire enemy crew completely in their tracks. What happened next became the most bizarre naval engagement of the entire Second World War, saved every American life aboard that ship, and changed destroyer doctrine across the entire Pacific Fleet for the next 40 years. But the story behind that 30 seconds of improvised madness begins not with a potato and not with a sailor. It begins with the worst stretch of American naval losses since Pearl Harbor, and a commander who was running out of options before the night even started. By early 1943, the Pacific War had entered its most savage phase. Guadalcanal had been won, but winning Guadalcanal was like surviving a knife fight while bleeding from both lungs. The United States Navy had lost 8 cruisers and 15 destroyers in those waters. The Japanese had absorbed comparable losses, but Japan possessed something that terrified American destroyer captains far more than any surface warship. Japan had submarines, and those submarines were hunting with extraordinary precision. Between January and March of 1943, Japanese submarines sank 4 American destroyers in the Solomons alone. USS De Haven, USS Aaron Ward, USS Tucker, USS Jarvis. 4 ships, 1,217 sailors dead. The pattern was always identical, and it was nearly impossible to counter. A destroyer moves through open water at night. A Japanese submarine lies submerged and waiting. The submarine fires Type 95 torpedoes, the fastest and most accurate submarine-launched weapons in any navy on Earth. The destroyer never sees them coming. 3 minutes later, the ship is gone. No warning. No defense. No survivors worth counting. Destroyer captains throughout the Pacific understood the mathematics of this problem with cold precision. You cannot outrun a torpedo once it is in the water. You cannot outmaneuver a weapon traveling at 49 knots. Your only real defense is to never occupy the water where the torpedo will arrive. And in the darkness of the Solomon Islands, surrounded by known Japanese submarine routes on every side, that meant every single night patrol was a calculated gamble against odds that kept worsening with each passing week. The sea that American sailors were required to cross was the same sea that was actively trying to swallow them. Commander Donald MacDonald understood this calculus better than most officers in the Pacific Fleet. MacDonald was 41 years old in April 1943, which made him ancient by the standards of destroyer command in a war where most captains were in their mid-30s and aging faster than their ships. He had commanded destroyers continuously for 17 months. 17 months of night patrols, of radar screens glowing green in darkened combat information centers, of sonar pings echoing back from nothing or from something that moved before you could target it. In those 17 months, despite pressing every engagement as aggressively as doctrine permitted, MacDonald had not confirmed a single submarine kill. That number haunted him in a specific way that only precise men can be haunted by precise failures. The problem was never aggression. MacDonald was known throughout the Pacific Fleet as a commander who closed the range when doctrine said to stand off, who trusted his crew completely and demanded they trust him in return. The problem was physics operating at the absolute edge of what his weapons could do. Depth charges required the enemy to be submerged. A submarine running on the surface rendered depth charges entirely useless. His 5-inch guns carried a minimum engagement range of 200 yards because the barrels could not depress far enough to target anything closer, and ramming a surfaced submarine in these waters carried a specific risk that kept destroyer captains awake at night far more than torpedoes did. Mine-laying submarines had been operating throughout the Solomons for months. Several Japanese I-class and RO-class boats were confirmed to be carrying contact mines rather than torpedoes. Hitting a fully loaded mine layer at flank speed would not sink the enemy. It would vaporize both vessels simultaneously. 288 men gone in a single flash of light. Every captain in the theater knew this. The knowledge sat behind every tactical decision, like a weight that never fully lifted. MacDonald knew it better than anyone when USS O'Bannon departed on the night of April 5, 1943, after a full day of providing naval gunfire support for Allied operations on New Georgia Island. The ship had been firing since early evening. Gun barrels were hot. Ammunition expenditure had been heavy. The crew was exhausted in the particular way that men get exhausted after hours of sustained combat operations, when the adrenaline has burned through and pure professionalism is all that remains. At 02:18 hours, MacDonald was in the Combat Information Center when his radar operator reported a contact. Speed 8 knots, range 9,350 yards, course steady, depth surfaced. Something was moving slowly on the surface in waters where no American vessel should be operating without coordination. The contact was not in the night's patrol schedule. The contact was not a friendly ship. MacDonald stared at the return on the scope for approximately 2 seconds, then ordered flank speed. O'Bannon surged forward through the dark Pacific. She was a Fletcher-class destroyer, one of the finest warships in the American fleet. 100 tons. 38 knots maximum speed. 5 5-inch guns. Torpedo tubes. Depth charge racks. And a crew that had already earned 17 battle stars, more than any other destroyer operating in the Pacific. She was fast and she was lethal, and she was closing the range at a rate that gave her captain approximately 4 minutes to make the most consequential decision of his command. The contact did not dive. This was the first anomaly, and it landed in MacDonald's mind with immediate weight. Any Japanese submarine commander worth his rank would have detected approaching propeller noise and ordered a crash dive within seconds of radar contact. A submerged submarine at night was nearly impossible to locate without precise sonar. Staying surfaced against an approaching destroyer at flank speed was not a tactical choice. It was suicide. Unless the lookouts had been asleep. Unless the submarine's radar had been damaged. Unless something had already gone catastrophically wrong aboard that vessel before O'Bannon ever appeared on the scope. The range collapsed. 8,000 yards. 6,000. 4,000. MacDonald could see the contact now, a dark shape pressed against slightly less dark water. The kind of visibility that sailors in the Solomons learned to use after months of operating in these specific conditions. At 1,000 yards, the lookouts called it RO class submarine, medium patrol type, 73 meters long, 4 torpedo tubes forward, single deck gun, 76 millimeter, approximately 66 men aboard. MacDonald made his decision in under 2 seconds. Ram her, flank speed. O'Bannon accelerated to 35 knots. The bow wave rose white and enormous in the darkness. The distance collapsed. 500 yards, 300, 200. The destroyer was a steel arrow aimed at the submarine's pressure hull, and at this speed with this mass, the impact would have crushed the Japanese vessel like a tin can beneath a boot. Then someone shouted from the bridge, "What if she's a mine layer?" The question hit MacDonald like a physical blow, because it was not a stupid question. It was the question. The one question that the entire tactical situation had been waiting to produce. Several Japanese submarines confirmed operating in these exact waters had been mine layers. Their cargo was not torpedoes. It was contact mines, each one capable of destroying a destroyer packed into a hull that was about to absorb the full kinetic energy of a 35-knot impact at point-blank range. The resulting explosion would not be a fire. It would be an event. It would be the absolute end of USS O'Bannon and every single man aboard her. MacDonald ordered hard left rudder. The destroyer heeled violently to port. Sailors grabbed every fixed surface within reach. Steel groaned through the hull as the ship fought its own massive momentum. The maneuver worked. Barely. The way things only work when everything else has already gone wrong. Instead of striking the submarine head-on, O'Bannon slid parallel to it. 70 yards of dark Pacific water separating two vessels, moving side by side in the darkness, close enough that sailors on both ships could see individual faces. And that was when MacDonald saw the faces. Japanese sailors on the submarine's deck. Dark shorts, blue caps, bare feet. They had been sleeping. Sleeping on the submarine's warm deck on a comfortable Pacific night, and O'Bannon's sudden approach had jolted them awake into a reality that defied every category of comprehension they possessed. An American destroyer at 70 yards. Moving. Right now. Then, for approximately 3 full seconds, nobody on either vessel moved. Then the Japanese sailors started running toward the 76mm deck gun. O'Bannon's 5-inch guns could not depress far enough to fire at 70 yards. Minimum engagement range was 200 yards. The 20mm anti-aircraft mounts were unmanned crew still positioned at surface battle stations. MacDonald ordered engines ahead full to try to open the range, but a 2,000-ton destroyer at flank speed does not accelerate instantaneously. Physics again. Always physics in this war. The Japanese were faster. They were already halfway to the gun. Once a trained crew loaded and fired a 76mm shell at 70 yards into O'Bannon's forward hull, the round would punch straight through the plating and detonate inside the forward magazine. The 288 men aboard would have approximately 0 seconds to respond to anything. On O'Bannon's deck, sailors grabbed whatever they could reach: wrenches, spanners, anything with weight and mass. The instinct was correct. The resources were catastrophically inadequate. You cannot stop a trained Japanese gun crew with a wrench thrown from 70 yards in total darkness. Then someone opened a locker near the forward deckhouse. Inside were sacks of potatoes. Maine potatoes. Part of the crew's food supply loaded at Tulagi Harbor 3 days earlier. Round. Firm. Roughly the size and weight of a Mark II fragmentation grenade. Ambrose Hardin grabbed the first one. He threw it. The potato crossed 70 yards of Pacific Ocean at approximately 50 miles per hour and struck a Japanese sailor directly in the shoulder. It bounced across the submarine's steel deck with a sound that every man on both vessels could hear clearly over the noise of two ships moving at speed through open water. The Japanese sailor froze. He stared at the object on the deck. He looked at O'Bannon. He looked back at the object. Then he dove for cover. Because in total darkness at 70 yards, traveling at grenade-throwing velocity, a Maine potato and a Mark II fragmentation grenade are functionally identical. Same size, same shape, same weight, same sound on impact. The only difference is the 3 to 5 second delay before one of them kills you. And a man who has seen American grenades in combat knows with absolute certainty that you do not stand around waiting to determine which one just landed at your feet. More sailors grabbed potatoes. They threw them one after another in a continuous barrage. The effect was instantaneous and total. Japanese sailors stopped running toward the gun. They started running away from the potatoes, picking them up and hurling them into the ocean, throwing themselves flat on the deck, shouting warnings to each other in desperate Japanese. Grenades. Grenades. The Americans are throwing grenades. Gunner Bud Merrow threw 6 potatoes in 30 seconds. 6 clean hits. Each one sent another enemy sailor scrambling for cover on his own deck. George Starkey stood on the amidships searchlight platform with a direct sightline to the entire submarine deck and watched what he would later describe as the most surreal moment of his 3 years of Pacific combat. Trained Japanese naval personnel men who had survived months of operations in the most contested waters on Earth were in complete chaos because of vegetables. The 76mm deck gun remained unmanned. MacDonald used every second. Engines ahead full. O'Bannon surged forward. 80 yards separation. 100. 150. The potatoes kept flying. The Japanese kept dodging. The gun stayed empty. At 200 yards, MacDonald ordered the barrage stopped. Now the 5-inch guns could fire. Commence firing. Gun Mount 2 spoke first. A 5-inch high-explosive shell crossed 200 yards in under 1 second and struck the submarine's conning tower with a blast that sailors felt through the soles of their boots. Gun Mount 4 fired immediately after. Another direct hit. The submarine's deck gun exploded in a single flash of white light. The barrel spun end over end before splashing into the ocean. The Japanese captain ordered crash dive. The bow dipped. Water flooded the deck. Some sailors reached the hatches. Some did not. MacDonald ordered hard right rudder, bringing O'Bannon directly over the submarine's dive point. 6 K-type depth charges set for 75 feet rolled off the stern racks. The ocean erupted. White columns of water rose 200 feet into the night sky. The shock waves slammed into O'Bannon's hull hard enough to knock men off their feet. Then silence. Oil spread across the surface. Debris surfaced. Wood, fabric, personal effects. The radar screen showed nothing. Only the oil remained spreading slowly in the Pacific darkness, marking the place where 66 men had been alive 1 hour before. But in MacDonald's Combat Information Center, as the radar confirmed a clean scope, and his crew began the careful business of reassessing damage and counting the living. The question that would define the next 48 hours was already forming. The oil was real. The debris was real. But oil and debris did not always mean a confirmed kill. And somewhere in the darkness, southwest of their position, something was moving. Something damaged. Something that thought the worst was already behind it. Something that was about to be found exactly where one American destroyer captain had already predicted it would be. In Part 2, we will see what happens when USS Strong picks up an unexpected radar contact northwest of the Russell Islands when 2 American destroyers close on a crippled submarine that believed it had already escaped, and when the full firepower of the United States Navy finishes what 30 seconds and a handful of potatoes had started. But more than that, we will see how the story of one bizarre night patrol began spreading across the Pacific, crossed an ocean in sailors' letters, and became something that even Commander Donald MacDonald, with all his battle stars and all his documented credibility, would never fully be able to correct. RO-34 had 48 hours left. And she did not know it yet. When Part 1 ended, USS O'Bannon had done the impossible. Commander Donald MacDonald had turned his ship at the last second to avoid a mine explosion. His crew had grabbed potatoes from a storage locker and frozen an entire enemy gun crew in their tracks. His 5-inch guns had hit Japanese submarine RO-34 twice. His depth charges had sent her diving into the darkness trailing oil. The radar screen had gone clean. By every reasonable measure, the engagement was finished. But RO-34 was not dead. She was damaged, leaking hydraulic fluid running on one functioning engine, her pressure hull compromised in at least 2 places, and the question of whether MacDonald's action report would survive scrutiny from Pearl Harbor was about to become the most dangerous threat he had faced all night. Here is the number that matters. Between April 1943 and the end of that same year, the United States Navy would file 847 submarine engagement reports in the Pacific Theater. Of those, only 31% would be confirmed as definitive kills. The remaining 69% would be reclassified as probable damage, inconclusive, or no effect. Careers ended over those reclassifications. Commands were reassigned. And MacDonald's report, with its unconventional engagement geometry and its deliberately omitted potato detail, was sitting in exactly the category that staff officers loved to question. And here is when things got considerably worse. The communication arrived from the operations section at Tassafaronga at 1400 hours on April 6th. It was not hostile. It was bureaucratic, which in the United States Navy of 1943 was frequently more dangerous than hostile. A senior staff officer reviewing MacDonald's action report had identified a discrepancy between the reported depth charge placement at 0235 and the ship's movement log. Specifically, O'Bannon's logged position at the time of the drop made a precise placement over the submarine's actual dive point statistically improbable, given the contact's last confirmed heading and speed. In plain language, the officer was questioning whether the depth charges had achieved anything at all, or had simply detonated somewhere in the general vicinity of water that may or may not have contained a Japanese submarine. The communication concluded with 5 words that MacDonald read 3 times. Please provide clarifying information at earliest. MacDonald set the paper down on his desk. He understood precisely what had happened. The staff officer had not been present for the engagement. The staff officer was working from coordinates and timestamps and movement logs, applying textbook submarine engagement doctrine to a situation that had not remotely resembled textbook doctrine from the moment someone shouted about mine layers. The approach had been unconventional. The turn had been unconventional. The parallel run at 70 yards had been something that no fleet training publication had ever anticipated describing. And the omission of the potato detail meant that the 30 seconds of improvisation that had actually made the gunnery solution possible were simply absent from the record, leaving a gap in the timeline that looked on paper like sloppiness. He called his executive officer in immediately. The XO read the communication, set it down, and looked at his captain. "They're going to reclassify it as inconclusive," the XO said. MacDonald nodded slowly. "Unless we find her again," he said. "And this time, there are no questions." The XO was quiet for a moment. "Joe Wellings has a radar contact, southwest. This morning at 0600, oil slick still coalescing." MacDonald stood up and reached for his chart. "She's on the bottom during daylight," he said. "Making repairs. She'll surface tonight." He put his finger on a point northwest of the Russell Islands. "Here, she'll try to make the passage before first light." The XO looked at the chart. "You're certain?" MacDonald looked at him with the particular steadiness of a man who has spent 17 months learning how damaged submarines think. "Get Wellings on the radio," he said. "Tell him we're going out tonight." Commander Joseph Wellings came aboard USS Strong at 1100 that morning, and the 2 captains met in MacDonald's sea cabin with charts spread between them and coffee going cold on the desk. Wellings had commanded Strong through 8 major surface engagements. He had a threshold for disbelief that was considerably higher than most officers in the Pacific Fleet. He listened to MacDonald describe the engagement in full sequence: the radar contact, the approach, the mine concern, the parallel run, the gun crew sprinting across the submarine's deck. Then MacDonald paused. "They couldn't depress the 5-inch guns far enough," he said. Wellings waited. "The crew grabbed what they had." Another pause. "Potatoes," MacDonald said. "From the ship's stores. A locker near the forward deckhouse." Wellings looked at him for a long moment. "Say that again." "My crew threw potatoes onto the submarine's deck. In the dark, at that range, a potato has essentially the same profile as a Mark II grenade. The Japanese sailors stopped moving toward the gun and started dodging the vegetables. We used the time to open the range to 200 yards and commence firing. Wellings was quiet for several seconds. He looked at the charts. He looked at his coffee. How many potatoes? I didn't count them, MacDonald said. Enough. And you didn't put this in the report. MacDonald met his eyes directly. The guns damaged the submarine Joe. The depth charges did the rest. The potatoes bought 30 seconds. I am not going to write 30 seconds of vegetables into an official naval action report. Wellings nodded once slowly. He understood the logic completely. He also understood something that MacDonald had not yet fully processed, which was that the letters were already written, the story was already moving, and 30 seconds of vegetables were about to become the most famous anecdote in the entire Pacific campaign. But he said none of this, because what he had actually come aboard to discuss was the radar contact from that morning and what it meant for that night. By 2000 hours, Strong and O'Bannon were at sea. The night was clear. 2 brief squalls had moved through between 1800 and midnight, reducing visibility to near zero before passing cleanly. The sea was running a moderate swell. Lookouts reported good horizon visibility once the second squall cleared. At 2012 hours, Strong's radar picked up a surface contact. Range 7,000 yards, speed 4 knots, barely moving. Heading southwest toward exactly the passage MacDonald had marked on the chart 6 hours earlier. Wellings put Strong on an intercept course. O'Bannon fell in behind. The range closed fast, 5,000 yards, 3,000. The contact was solid on the scope, moving slowly but consistently. At 3,000 yards, Strong's lookouts made visual confirmation. A Japanese submarine RO class, running on the surface, trailing a thin dark line of oil, visible even in the low light of a quarter moon. RO-34. She had done exactly what MacDonald had predicted. She had sat on the bottom during daylight, made emergency repairs on her compromised pressure hull, redistributed ballast to compensate for forward flooding, jury-rigged one of her engines to minimum propulsion, and surfaced at nightfall to run for home at 4 knots. Her crew had done everything right. They had survived when survival appeared impossible. They had patched what could not be patched and kept moving when the physics said stop. They did not survive the next 4 minutes. At 2,000 yards, Strong opened fire. 3 rounds of 5-inch high explosive. 2 struck the pressure hull directly. The third hit the base of the conning tower. Metal screamed across open water. The conning tower buckled visibly, the entire upper structure twisting sideways as its supports gave way. Japanese sailors came topside, immediately moving toward the deck gun with the same trained urgency that O'Bannon's crew had interrupted with potatoes 48 hours earlier. This time, there were no potatoes. This time, there were 10 5-inch guns between 2 American destroyers, and O'Bannon had just cleared minimum engagement range. MacDonald ordered commence firing at 2003. Both destroyers fired together. Shell after shell crossed the water and struck the submarine's hull, her deck, her damaged conning tower. The deck gun took a direct hit from O'Bannon's Mount II and exploded in a single flash of white light. The barrel spun end over end before splashing into the ocean 20 yards from the hull. RO-34's pressure hull was being torn apart in real time. There could be no crash dive. The repairs that had kept her alive through 48 hours of hiding on the ocean floor had been sufficient for slow surface transit. They were not sufficient for diving. The sea was entering faster than any remaining pump could address. At 2017 hours, the bow slipped beneath the surface. The stern rose propellers still turning in a last mechanical reflex. Then the stern went under too. Bubbles and oil and debris spread across the surface. Strong and O'Bannon held position and watched. No survivors. No rescue attempt. Only oil and the settling wreckage of a submarine that had believed the worst was already behind it. MacDonald stood on the bridge for a long time after the debris settled. He had thrown potatoes at those men 2 nights ago. Now they were gone. He was not sentimental, in any way he would have articulated aloud. But he was precise, and precision required him to acknowledge that the men sinking beneath the surface at 2017 on April 7th were the same men who had scrambled for cover on a submarine deck when vegetables started landing around them. They had survived that night. They had not survived this one. The second action report, filed at 0600 on April 8th, contained nothing the staff officer could question. Both destroyers had witnessed the sinking. The debris was unambiguous. The oil slick at first light measured 300 yards across. The response from Halsey's headquarters arrived on April 12th, confirming Japanese submarine RO-34 sunk April 7th, 1943, by USS Strong and USS O'Bannon operating in conjunction. The earlier question about depth charge placement was not mentioned. The earlier communication was not mentioned. The potato detail was not mentioned by anyone in any official document at any level of Pacific Fleet Command. It was only mentioned in letters. 12 of them already cleared Navy censorship by the time the confirmation arrived, stamped approved, and sailing east across the Pacific toward home addresses in 12 American states. The censors had read them, had found nothing of operational intelligence. Value had laughed and had let them go. What possible military secret could be extracted from a story about potatoes? The letters were already moving. The story had already escaped. And in a farmhouse in rural Massachusetts, a mother was about to receive a letter from her 22-year-old son describing the strangest 30 seconds of his life, and the Maine potato growers were about to read a newspaper account that would prompt an emergency board meeting, a unanimous vote, and the commissioning of a brass plaque that would get the facts almost entirely wrong, while capturing something true about what had actually happened on that submarine deck in the dark. But the legend was the least of what was coming, because while American newspapers were beginning to celebrate a destroyer that had fought with vegetables, Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Rabaul was conducting a very different kind of review. Between January and May of 1943, Japan had lost 11 submarines in the Central and Upper Solomons, 11 vessels, roughly 700 men. The operational pattern emerging from the loss reports pointed to something specific and deeply alarming. American destroyers were pressing their attacks closer than doctrine had ever permitted, closing to ranges where Japanese submarines had no tactical answer. The Imperial Navy was about to change its orders for every submarine commander operating in the Solomons, and that change, intended to protect Japanese vessels, was about to create a new problem that nobody aboard O'Bannon had anticipated. A problem that would make RO-34 look simple. A problem that was accelerating through the Solomon Islands in September 1943, toward a darkness and a collision that no potato, no radar system, and no depth charge could have prepared Donald MacDonald or his crew to survive. In Part 3, we will see what happens at Vela La Vela, when 9 Japanese destroyers move at 28 knots through the dark, when a torpedo removes the forward third of USS Chevalier in under 1 second, and when O'Bannon, committed to flank speed with no room to maneuver, hits her own sister ship at 25 knots and 61 American sailors die not from enemy fire, but from steel and water, and the physics of a war moving faster than any human reaction time could match. The potato legend was established. The confirmed kill was on the record. But the real cost of 37 months in command was still coming. And it was coming fast. By the end of Part 2, USS O'Bannon and USS Strong had finished what 30 seconds of potatoes had started. RO-34 was on the bottom. The confirmed kill was in Halsey's records, and MacDonald's letters from his sailors were already crossing the Pacific carrying the strangest combat story of the entire war. But the Japanese Navy had noticed the pattern of losses. 11 submarines gone between January and May 1943. And Imperial headquarters in Rabaul was not attributing those losses to bad luck. They were attributing them to something specific, something American destroyer captains were doing differently, something that needed an immediate tactical answer. The potato legend was just beginning, and the real test was just arriving. Here is the number that the Japanese naval staff was staring at in May 1943. In a 6-week period across the Central Solomons, American destroyers had engaged surfaced submarines at ranges below 300 yards on 4 separate confirmed occasions. 4 engagements, 3 of them resulting in confirmed kills. The standard engagement range for destroyer versus submarine combat, according to every doctrine manual in every navy on Earth, was between 500 and 1,500 yards. American captains were operating at less than a quarter of that range. And at those distances, Japanese submarines had no effective answer. Torpedoes required a minimum arming distance of 300 yards to function. The deck gun could not track a moving destroyer at under 200 yards with any accuracy. The submarine was functionally weaponless once an American destroyer committed to closing that tight. Admiral Meiichi Koga convened an emergency analysis session at Rabaul in late May. The officers reviewing the loss reports identified the pattern within the first hour. The conclusion was unanimous. American destroyer captains had stopped being afraid of the range where doctrine said they would die. Koga issued new standing orders to every submarine commander operating in the Solomons. Surface only under absolute operational necessity. Dive at first radar contact regardless of range. Accept slower transit times as the cost of survival. The orders were sensible. They were also an admission that USS O'Bannon and commanders like MacDonald had fundamentally changed the calculus of submarine warfare in the Pacific. Japan's submarine force had been neutralized as a surface threat in the Solomons, but neutralizing submarines created a different problem that nobody in MacDonald's crew had anticipated. If Japanese submarines were staying submerged, they were harder to find. The close-range surface engagements that had earned O'Bannon her battle stars were becoming rarer because the targets were no longer presenting themselves. And simultaneously, Japan was accelerating a completely different tactical problem throughout the Solomons. Destroyers against destroyers. At night. At close range. In narrow island passages, where radar gave you seconds and physics gave you less. The Tokyo Express. Japan's high-speed destroyer resupply and evacuation runs through the slot had delivered over 40,000 troops and thousands of tons of supplies to Japanese positions throughout the campaign. American destroyer forces had been interdicting those runs with increasing effectiveness, but the cost was compounding. Between July and September 1943, the United States lost 5 destroyers in night surface engagements in the Solomons, not to submarines, to other destroyers, to torpedoes fired at ranges where radar contacts became ship-killing decisions in under 30 seconds. The tactical environment that MacDonald had mastered against submarines was about to reveal its most dangerous edge, and O'Bannon, with her 17 battle stars, and her crew of men who had been at sea together since Guadalcanal, was about to discover the specific cost of operating at the margin where experience and physics run directly into each other. September 3, 1943. Vela Lavella Island, Solomon Islands, 22:45 hours. American intelligence had confirmed it. Japan was evacuating approximately 600 troops from Vela Lavella using 9 destroyers pushing through the slot at maximum speed to complete the extraction before dawn. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger had 6 American destroyers to stop them. O'Bannon was on the left flank. MacDonald had been at sea continuously for 31 months. His crew knew night surface combat the way surgeons know their instruments. Radar contact came at 22:45. Multiple targets. Bearing northwest. Range 12,000 yards. Speed 28 knots. The Japanese were not hiding. They were running hard. The range collapsed. Contact solid. 10,000 yards. 8,000. 6. At 5,000 yards, Moosbrugger's lead destroyers launched torpedoes. 24 weapons in the water. Running hot and straight. The Japanese did not detect them in time. At 2300, the first torpedoes found their targets. Japanese destroyer Yugumo erupted. The detonation was visible from 12 miles away. A white column of fire rising 200 feet. Secondary explosions as her magazines cooked off in sequence. She was gone in 4 minutes. O'Bannon opened fire at the same moment. 10 rounds from the 5-inch guns. 3 confirmed hits on a second Japanese destroyer. Target turning hard. Trailing smoke. MacDonald ordered pursuit. He had the range. He had the angle. He had the momentum of a ship that had done this 17 times before. The battle was moving exactly as trained. Exactly as planned. Then the darkness produced the thing that no plan survives. USS Chevalier, running ahead of O'Bannon at 30 knots, took a Japanese torpedo in her bow at 2,307. The impact detonated Chevalier's forward magazine. The explosion removed the entire forward third of the ship in under 1 second. The remaining 2/3 slewed sideways across O'Bannon's path, dead in the water. Hull perpendicular to the bearing that O'Bannon was already committed to at flank speed. No warning, no interval, just a ship that had been moving at 30 knots suddenly existing as a stationary object directly ahead. MacDonald saw it. All back emergency. Hard right rudder. Everything physics would allow in the available time. Physics allowed very little. O'Bannon's bow struck Chevalier's hull at approximately 25 knots. The impact crushed 40 feet of O'Bannon's forward section. Steel screamed. The forward compartments flooded in seconds. Sailors in the berthing spaces below the waterline had no warning and no time. Chevalier's ruptured hull tore through O'Bannon's bow plating like a blade. The 2 ships locked briefly, then separated. O'Bannon falling back as her momentum died, her bow opened to the Pacific. 61 men died in that collision. Not from enemy fire, from metal and water and the physics of a night engagement where 2 seconds of warning is mathematically insufficient. MacDonald stood on the bridge and ran damage control. Pumps engaged. Watertight doors sealed. The forward magazine flooded deliberately to prevent an explosion that would have replicated what had just destroyed Chevalier. The flooding bought stability. O'Bannon would not sink. She would limp. And the fighting was over. The Japanese evacuated 589 troops from Vella La Vella that night. The battle was an American tactical defeat, wrapped inside a strategic campaign that Japan was losing regardless of individual engagements. But the 61 men in O'Bannon's forward compartments did not die for a strategic abstraction. They died in darkness and cold water and the specific violence of metal failing at speed. MacDonald stood on the bridge for a long time after the damage control teams reported compartments sealed. He was precise enough to understand exactly what had happened, and experienced enough to know that understanding it changed nothing about the outcome. O'Bannon entered Tassafaronga Harbor on September 5th with 40 feet of her bow missing. In the following days, MacDonald wrote 61 letters. He wrote them in order, starting with the most senior rating and working down to the youngest. Each letter was specific. Each described the man accurately. Each avoided the comfortable vagueness that made grief easier to deliver and harder to believe. He did not mention potatoes in any of them. Those families deserved better. In October, O'Bannon departed for Pearl Harbor, under her own power at 12 knots, with temporary bow patching that the Tulagi shipyard had installed over 5 days of continuous work. She entered dry dock on October 31st, and at Pearl Harbor, every sailor in the Pacific Fleet had already heard the potato story. When O'Bannon's crew came ashore, men from other ships asked immediately, "How many potatoes did the Japanese really panic? Did you beat a submarine with vegetables?" O'Bannon's crew was tired of the story in a way that was difficult to explain to people who had not been there. They had fought 8 major surface engagements. They had sunk multiple enemy vessels. They had earned 17 battle stars. Nobody asked about those. They asked about potatoes. Japan had by this point lost 38 destroyers since Guadalcanal. America had lost 22. Japan could not replace hers at the same production rate. America could and was doing so at a pace that the Japanese naval staff in Tokyo had privately acknowledged as unsurvivable in a sustained exchange. The individual tactical outcomes, Vela Lavella included, were being overridden by an industrial arithmetic that Japan had never possessed the capacity to match. O'Bannon's new bow was installed at Pearl Harbor through November. She rejoined the fleet in January 1944. Task Force 58, the Marshall Islands, the Philippine Sea, Surigao Strait, where her torpedoes found Japanese battleship Yamashiro in October 1944, and 1,200 men went to the bottom of the strait. The record kept accumulating. The plaque from Maine stayed mounted near the mess hall, getting the facts wrong every day. And somewhere in the expanding legend of a destroyer that fought with vegetables, the actual record of what O'Bannon had accomplished across 32 months of continuous combat was becoming harder to see clearly behind the story that everyone preferred. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, USS O'Bannon had been awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. Admiral Halsey personally selected her to escort USS Missouri into Tokyo Bay for the surrender ceremony. MacDonald stood on the bridge and watched Japanese officials sign the documents that ended the war he had been fighting since 1941. The potato plaque was still in the mess hall. It still said the wrong thing. And in naval archives from Pearl Harbor to Washington, the full record of what O'Bannon had actually done across 37 months of Pacific combat was sitting intact and largely unread behind a story about a farm boy from Massachusetts who threw a vegetable in the dark. But here is the question that nobody asked MacDonald standing in Tokyo Bay, and the question that almost nobody has asked in the 80 years since. What happened to him after the war ended? What happened to Ambrose Hardin? What happened to the 61 names that MacDonald wrote letters for and never mentioned in public again? And what does the gap between the potato legend and the actual record tell us about how wars get remembered, which stories survive, and which ones get smaller every decade until the people who lived them are gone? The story of USS O'Bannon has one final chapter. It is the chapter that MacDonald spent 50 years trying to tell accurately to people who consistently preferred the other version, and in Part 4, we will tell it completely. 4 parts, 4 nights. Across 3 years of Pacific combat, we followed Donald MacDonald from his first radar contact in the Solomons to the collision at Vela Lavella that killed 61 of his men. We watched Ambrose Hardin throw the first potato and saw Reader's Digest turn 30 seconds of improvisation into a 6-page legend. We saw RO-34, sunk Yamashiro capsized, and 9 confirmed aircraft kills during a single afternoon at the Philippine Sea. The record was undeniable. The potato plaque was inaccurate. And the question left at the end of Part 3 was the one that matters most about any man who does something extraordinary in wartime. What happens to him when the war ends? The answer in MacDonald's case is both straightforward and quietly devastating. Because success, it turns out, sometimes arrives wearing a costume that makes it almost impossible to recognize. The Navy promoted MacDonald to captain in October 1945 and gave him command of a cruiser. He left O'Bannon in November of that year after 37 months in command, a tenure that no other destroyer captain in the Pacific had matched. More than 800 destroyer commanders had been killed or relieved during the war. MacDonald outlasted every single one of them. The Navy recognized this with 2 Navy Crosses, 3 Silver Stars, 2 Legions of Merit, and 2 Bronze Stars, the most decorated destroyer commander of the entire Second World War. On paper, a complete success. He retired from the Navy in 1953, settled in California, raised a family, and spent the next 2 decades in defense, contracting, sitting in rooms where people discussed the lessons of the Pacific War in abstract strategic terms, while he held a specific operational knowledge of what those lessons had actually cost, in names and compartments, and forward magazines flooded in the dark. For 40 years after the war ended, people asked him about the potatoes. Journalists sought him out. Veterans groups invited him to speak. Naval historians included him in footnotes. He gave the same answer every time: precise, patient, slightly tired. The potatoes bought 30 seconds, nothing more. USS Strong sank that submarine 2 days later. Few people listened. The legend was better than the truth, and MacDonald had enough self-awareness to understand that correcting the legend was a project that would outlast him. He died in 1995 at the age of 93. His obituary, published in 2 California newspapers, mentioned the potatoes in the first paragraph. It mentioned Guadalcanal in the 4th. The presidential unit citation appeared in the 7th. The 61 men who died at Vela La Vela were not mentioned at all. MacDonald had known this would happen. He had spent 50 years watching the potato story consume the rest of the record, and he had made his peace with it in the way that precise, unsentimental men make peace with things they cannot change. By continuing to tell the accurate version whenever anyone asked, and by not being surprised when they prefer the inaccurate one. But his real legacy was never in the obituaries. It was never in the plaque. It was in something that no newspaper in 1943 had the technical vocabulary to describe accurately, and that no brass casting from Maine could have captured, even if the inscription had been correct. The tactical lesson underneath the potato legend did not die with RO-34. It moved. By late 1943, destroyer engagement doctrine throughout the Pacific had shifted measurably toward more aggressive close-range prosecution of surface contacts. The shift had multiple causes, including improved radar systems, better night optics, and accumulated combat experience distributed across the entire destroyer force. But the psychological component of the shift, the willingness to close to ranges where standard doctrine said you would be destroyed, was something that the O'Bannon engagements had made thinkable in a specific way. When a captain at Pearl Harbor could point to MacDonald's confirmed record and say that closing to 70 yards from a surfaced submarine had produced a kill with 0 American casualties, the argument for aggressive prosecution became easier to make at every command level. The Fletcher-class destroyer itself, O'Bannon's hull type, went on to serve in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and in the navies of 15 Allied nations through transfer programs extending into the 1980s. The tactical principles developed in the Solomons campaign became foundational elements of destroyer doctrine for the entire post-war period, absorbed into the institutional knowledge of surface warfare, even as the specific potato detail was remembered as comedy rather than doctrine. More than 175 Fletcher-class destroyers were built during and after the war. The last one was retired from active service in 1999 in the Greek Navy, 56 years after Ambrose Harden reached into a storage locker in the Solomon Islands. The principle that close-range improvisation could defeat a technically superior threat when doctrine failed had traveled from one dark night in the Pacific to 5 decades of surface warfare across 15 countries. That is what 30 seconds actually bought. Not just RO-34, all of that. But the largest lesson of the O'Bannon story has nothing to do with destroyer tactics or potato aerodynamics or the specific geometry of a 70-yard parallel run in the dark. It has to do with what happens inside a crew that has trained together long enough to read each other's intentions without being told what to do. Ambrose Harden made his decision in under 1 second. No training protocol covered it. No superior officer authorized it. No weapons manual described a potato as a valid combat tool under any circumstances. He saw a problem, assessed the available materials, and acted. And because the men around him immediately understood what he was doing and joined in. Without discussion, 6 men were throwing potatoes in coordinated sequence within seconds of the first throw. That kind of response does not develop from drills alone. It develops from 31 months of making life and death decisions together under time pressure with incomplete information and surviving. The potato worked because O'Bannon's crew was ready to throw it, and the crew was ready because MacDonald had built something across 17 battle stars that no fleet training manual could specify or measure. A shared willingness to do the necessary thing before anyone had determined what the necessary thing was. The Second World War produced dozens of similar cases where individual improvisation changed operational outcomes. The proximity fuse, designed partly by a team that included a former jazz musician with no formal engineering background. The DUKW amphibious vehicle conceived by a yacht designer who had never worked on a military project. The Norden bomb sight developed by a civilian watchmaker who was initially dismissed by every procurement officer who reviewed his proposal. In every case, the breakthrough came when a specific individual decided that the potential cost of trying was lower than the certain cost of not trying. MacDonald had calculated that cost on the bridge of O'Bannon in the fraction of a second between seeing Japanese sailors sprint toward a deck gun and deciding whether to open the range or buy time. His crew had supplied the whatever. That calculation made in darkness with no good options is the actual lesson of the potato battle, not the vegetable. The willingness to use it. Now here is the detail that almost nobody who has written about O'Bannon has ever mentioned, and it changes the meaning of everything that came after. The brass plaque from Maine was mounted near the mess hall in June 1943, and remained there through every subsequent engagement through the Philippine Sea, through Surigao Strait, through the escort into Tokyo Bay, until O'Bannon was decommissioned in March 1946. After decommissioning, the plaque's location became uncertain. Naval records from the period of scrapping show no specific disposition for the item. A maritime museum in New England displayed a plaque matching its description through the early 1970s. Then the museum's records show it as missing without explanation sometime between 1971 and 1973. The same years O'Bannon herself was being cut apart for scrap in a Philadelphia yard. What happened to it is genuinely unknown. But here is what is known. In 2003, a retired machinist's mate named Gerald Forrest, who had served aboard O'Bannon from 1944 to decommissioning, contacted the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington. Forrest stated that in 1946, when O'Bannon's crew was dispersing for the final time, several sailors had divided up informal mementos. Forrest himself had kept a potato, not a real one. A potato-shaped piece of steel he had machined himself in the ship's workshop sometime in late 1944, when the legend was already fully formed, and the crew had begun to develop a complicated relationship with a story that was both theirs and not theirs simultaneously. He had carried it in his sea bag for 2 years. He carried it home to Ohio in 1946. He still had it in 2003 when he contacted the Heritage Command. He described it as approximately the size and weight of a Maine potato, machined from a piece of scrap steel, taken from O'Bannon's forward repair locker, polished smooth by 57 years of being handled. He donated it to the Heritage Command's collection, where it remains today cataloged not under weapons or equipment or tactical innovation, but under a category the archivists created specifically for the donation. Crew improvisation. That is the category. Crew improvisation. It is the most accurate description of what happened on April 5, 1943, that any official document has ever produced. More accurate than the action report, more accurate than the plaque, more accurate than 6 pages in Reader's Digest. A machinist's mate with 57 years and a piece of scrap steel got closer to the truth than any of them. From a farm boy in rural Massachusetts who grabbed a potato from a storage locker to a tactical lesson that shaped surface warfare doctrine across 15 navies and 5 decades, USS O'Bannon. And her crew proved something permanent about the nature of combat and the nature of the people who survive it. Seaman. First Class Ambrose Harden lived until 2006 and confirmed every detail of that 30 seconds to every journalist who found him with the patient pleasure of a man who had decided long ago to be comfortable with exactly the role history had assigned him. Commander Donald MacDonald spent 50 years correcting a plaque that nobody wanted corrected because the accurate version was actually more remarkable than the legend, and he was too precise to let the gap between them go unacknowledged. And 61 men who died in O'Bannon's forward compartments at Vela La Vela on September 3, 1943, received letters that described them accurately, written by a captain who understood that they deserved better than comfort and better than vagueness and better than being forgotten behind a story about vegetables. The most dangerous weapon in any navy is not a gun or a torpedo or a depth charge or a potato. It is a crew that trusts each other completely, that acts before the procedure catches up to the situation, and that can recognize in total darkness, with no training and no authorization, that the right tool for the job is whatever is within reach when the moment arrives. If you know a story like this one, a moment where someone improvised something impossible and the history books buried it under something easier to remember, tell it in the comments below. These stories deserve to be told accurately. McDonald spent 50 years proving that. And somewhere in a naval archive in Washington, a piece of machined steel the size and weight of a Maine potato is sitting in a collection category called crew improvisation, which is the most honest epitaph that any weapon from the Second World War has ever received. Hey,